Please purchase a personal license to remove this message. The rise of the West and its consequences. With the decline of the Turks, international leadership passed from the Muslims to the non-Muslim nations of the West, which had been preparing for this for a long time and were now left without a rival. By virtue of conquest, or cultural, economic or political penetration, their influence quickly spread throughout the globe. The history of Western civilization. Western civilization is not of recent origin. Its roots go back thousands of years to ancient Greece and Rome. The Western outlook on life and ethics can be traced directly to the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. The Western nations kept cultivating the spirit, the philosophy, the sciences, the literature, and the ideas of the Greek and Roman cultures until the 19th century, when they created a new faith. It is possible to be deceived by the splendor of the new faith, but the fact remains that its substance was made up of Greek and Roman materials. The Greek civilization was the first clear manifestation of the Western mind. It was the first civilization to be built exclusively on Western intellectual arid ethical ideals and aspirations. Greek civilization. The intellectual fundamentals of Greek civilization may be summed up as follows: T11 rise of the Tst I 234103 disregard of transcendental truths, want of religious feeling and spirituality, worship of material comfort, and exaggerated patriotism. Greek civilization was per Lemire 1 eolistic. The Greeks could not even conceive God without giving him physical forms and shapes, and making images for his attributes and installing them in their temples so as to lend a visible aspect to their devotions. They had a god of sustenance, a god of benevolence, a god of fury, and so on. All the attributes of physical existence were ascribed to these gods. Even abstract concepts such as beauty and love were symbolized as separate deities. The logical lists on 10 kinds of predication and 9 heavens in the categories of Aristotle were also but the products of materialistic rationality, from the epochs of which that Greek spirit could never free itself. A brilliant interpretation of ancient Greek civilization was once given by Dr. Haas, a German scholar, in 3 lectures he delivered in Geneva on what is European civilization. He held that the first stage for European civilization was set by ancient Greece, where the aim was to develop man harmoniously. The supreme measure was a beautiful body. It clearly emphasized the senses. Physical education, games and dancing, and mental education, poetry, music, drama, philosophy, even the sciences were kept in proportion so as to develop the mind but not at the expense of the body. Its religion had no spirituality, no theology, no mysticism. Too many Vestem writers have similarly drawn attention to the spiritual ineffectiveness of the religion and the lack of moral enthusiasm and dignity in the religious practices and festivals of the Greeks. Lecky, for instance, says the Greek spirit was essentially rationalistic and eclectic, the Egyptian spirit was essentially mystical and devotional. The Egyptian deities, it was observed by Apuleius, were chiefly honored by lamentations, and the Greek divinities by dances. The truth of that last part of this very significant remark appears in every 104 is. Lam and the world page of Greek history. No nation has a richer collection of g.ims and festivals growing out of its religious cistern. In none did a light, sportive and often licentious fancy play more fearlessly around the popular creed, in none was religious terrorism more rare. The divinity was seldom looked upon as holier than man, and a due observance of certain rites and ceremonies was deemed an ample tribute to pay to her. 153 There was nothing incomprehensible in this sorry state of affairs, for, apart from the general Western conception of faith as a purely utilitarian proposition, the basic structure of the theological metaphysics of the Greeks was such that it left very little room for the development of the spirit of religious reverence and awe. the denial of the attributes of God and of his personal control over the universe, and the replacement of him as the creator and the sustainer of the worlds by a supposed active intellect, could only lead to the destruction of spiritual enthusiasm. Why would one adore God with his body and spirit and address one's prayers and petitions to him if one did not have faith in his beneficent care and dispensation? Thus, Greek civilization was utterly agnostic. The Greeks did not strictly deny God, but they had no place for him in their practical scheme of things. They supposed that he had, after having brought forth the active intellect, retreated into seclusion. Naturally enough, they did not look upon divinity as more holy than man. We read about so many inventors in history, but do they inspire a feeling of reverence? The worship of idols, the exaggeration of emphasis on material comfort, the devotion to idols and pictures, music, and the other fine arts, the extravagant notion of individual liberty and the excessive indulgence in games, sports, and festivals had a handful effect on the Greek mind and morals. Hideous excesses of unnatural lust and unending protests and revolts against all forms of authority gradually became the order of the day, vulgarity received a charter and greed became rampant. The description of the democratic young man given by Plato is not dissimilar to what happens in our own times. He writes Ti1 rise cf the ivist. He will not receive or suffer within the ramparts the true reasoning of anyone who asserts that some pleasures spring from the desires that are good and noble, but others from those evil, and T11 at the former should be fostered and honored, and the latter disciplined and enslaved. To all such remarks, he shakes his head, and says that all are alike and deserving of equal honor. Day after day he gratifies the pleasures as they come, now floating down the primrose path of wine, now given over to teetotalism and hunting, one day in hard hunting, the next slacking and idling, and the third playing the philosopher. And he will take to politics, leap to his feet and do or say whatever comes into his head, or he comes to admire military people and inclines to their way of life, or he would look jealously at a man of business and take to his profession. He, in short, takes this light as pleasant and free and blessed and leads his life like this right up to the end. 54R05 Another major characteristic of the Western SPMT is its narrow nationalism. Nationalism is much more intense in Europe than in Asia. This is due, partly, to geographical reasons. In Asia, the natural regions are extensive, with a wide range of physical, climatic, and ethnological diversities. The land is more fertile and can support life with greater ease. The tendency in India has always been, therefore, towards large, multiracial states, and the world's MMT extensive empires were established on the subcontinent. Europe, on the contra, is split up into a large number of small territorial units, segregated from each other by formidable natural barriers like high mountains and deep rivers. The population in these areas is dense, the pressure on land is heavy, and the means of subsistence are scarce. The struggle for existence is very acute. All these factors have contributed to the creation of a strong national sentiment, particularly in Central and Western Europe, where the idea 106 Islam and the world of a political community could not extend beyond the bounds of a city-state. The entire civilization of the Greeks was built around their city-states. Lecky says that the state occupied a predominance in the Greek mind, and virtue was firmly connected with patriotism. The cosmopolitanism of Socrates and Anaxagoras had made little impression upon the Hellenes. Aristotle's system of ethics was based on differentiation between the Greeks and the non-Greeks. According to him, the Greeks had no more obligations to barbarians foreigners than to virile beasts. In fact, when a philosopher declared that his sympathies extended beyond his own state and included all the people of Greece, he caused great astonishment among his own Roman civilization. Greeks had developed a brilliant literature, philosophy, and civilization, while the Romans had only just emerged from a military stage. In these circumstances, it was only natural for the Romans, when they conquered Greece, to become imbued with the intellect and manners of the Greeks. It is also evident that the Greeks, having had for several centuries a splendid literature, at a time when the Romans had none, and when the Latin language was still too crude for literary purposes, the period in which the Romans first emerged from a purely military condition would bring with it an ascendancy of Greek ideas. Fabius Pictor and Cincet I Alimentus, the earliest native historians, both wrote in Greek. After the conquest of Greece, the political ascendancy of the Romans and the intellectual ascendancy of Greece were alike universal. The conquered people, whose patriotic feelings had been greatly enfeebled by the influences I have noticed, acquiesced readily in their new condition, and notwithstanding the vehement exertions of the rise of the one-vest conservative party, Greek manners, sentiments, and ideas soon penetrated all classes and molded all forms of Roman life. 155-07 The Roman religion had never been a source of moral enthusiasm. Being wholly paganish and superstitious, it was altogether incapable of checking the progress of scepticism and unbelief among its followers. Consequently, as the Romans advanced cularly, they grew openly contemptuous of their faith. They had already decided that their gods had nothing to do with the management of the practical affairs of this world. Cicero reports that when lines declaring that the gods took no care of the things of man were read in theaters, the audiences responded with loud applause. 156 St. Augustine and other fathers long after ridiculed the pagans who satirized in the theaters the very gods they worshipped in their temples. 157 The spirit of religious reverence had, indeed, become so weak that when the fleet of Augustus was wrecked, he solemnly degraded the status of Neptune, the sea god. At the death of Gem I Anarchus, people freely stoned and overthrew the altars of the gods. 5-8 Religion in Rome was, in TMTH, nothing more than a social tradition and a utilitarian formula. To quote Lecky once again. The Roman religion was purely selfish. It was simply a method of obtaining prosperity, averting calamity, and reading the future. Ancient Rome produced many heroes, but no saints. Its self-sacrifice was patriotic, not religious. Its religion was neither an independent teacher nor a source of inspiration. R59 A natural corollary of the naked materialism of the Romans was imperialism and exploitation of the weaker nations for selfish motives. This, too, has been inherited in toto by modern Europe. According to Muhammad Asad. The underlying idea of the Roman Empire was the conquest of power and the exploitation of other nations for the benefit of the mother country alone. To promote R08 Islam and the world better living for a privileged group, no violence vas for the Romans too bad, no injustice too base. The famous Roman justice was justict for the Romans alone. It is dear that such an attitude was possible only on the basis of an entirely materialistic conception of life and civilization, a materialism certainly refined by an intellectual taste, but nonetheless foreign to all spiritual values. The Romans never in reality knew religion. Their traditional gods were a pale imitation of Greek mythology, colorless ghosts, silently accepted for the benefit of social convention. In no way were the gods allowed to interfere with real life. They had to give oracle through the medium of their priests if they were asked, but they were never supposed to confer moral laws upon men. 160 During its dosing years the Roman Empire was transformed into a sea of corruption and evil. The original military discipline of the Romans and the simplicity of their ethical code were swept away by the avalanche of wealth and luxury. John William Draper gives the following excellent portrayal of the conditions that prevailed in Rome at that time when the empire in a military and political sense had reached its culmination. in a religious and social aspect it had attained its height of immorality. It had become thoroughly Epicurean. Its maxim was that life should be made a feast, that virtue is only the seasoning of pleasure, and temperance the means of prolonging it. Dining rooms glittering with gold and encrusted with gems, slaves, and superb apparel, the fascinations of feminine society where all the women were dissolute, magnificent baths, theaters, gladiators, such were the objects of Roman desire. The conquerors of the world had tly rise of tly Ives discovered that the only thing worth worshipping was force. By it all things might be secured, all that toil and trade had laboriously obtained. The confiscation of goods and lands, the taxation of provinces, were the reward of successful warfare, and the emperor was a symbol of force. Re was a social splendor, but it was the phosphorescent corruption of the ancient Mediterranean world. 161I09 Christianity spreads across the Roman Empire. The establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, which was made possible by the ascension of Constantine to the throne of the Caesars in 305 CE, was an event of revolutionary importance. Christianity, thereby, came to possess an empire which it would not otherwise have dared dream of, as Constantine's victory was the outcome of the heroic sacrifices of his Christian supporters. He duly rewarded them with a generous share in the affairs of the empire. The paganization of Christianity in reality, however, this was a most inosp 1c1 Usman, anti for Christianity. The religion did gain an empire, but lost its soul. The Christians had won on the field of battle, but they were completely rooted in the realm of faith and morality. The pagans and, what was more the Christians themselves, wrenched the Christian creed out of shape, and in this unfortunate development Constantine himself played no small part. Says Draper Place, power, profit these were in view of whoever now joined the conquering sect. Crowds of worldly persons, who cared nothing about its religious ideas, became its warmest supporters. Pagans at heart, their influence was soon manifested in the paganization of Christianity that ensued forthwith. The emperor, no better than they, did nothing to check their proceedings. Islam and the world, but he did not personally conform one to the ceremonial requirements of the Church until the dose of his evil Lifo ad 337.162. Though the Christian party had proved itself sufficiently strong to give a master to the empire, it was never sufficiently strong to destroy its antagonist, paganism. The issue of struggle between them was an amalgamation of the principles of both. In this, Christianity differed from Mohammedanism, which absolutely annihilated its antagonist and spread its own doctrines without adulteration. 63 To the emperor, a mere worldling, a man without any religious convictions, doubtless it appeared best for himself, best for the empire, and best for the contending parties, Christian and pagan, to promote their union or amalgamation as much as possible. Even sincere Christians do not seem to have been averse to this. Perhaps they believed that the new doctrines would diffuse most thoroughly by incorporating in them ideas borrowed from the old, that truth would assert herself in the end and the impurity be cast off. 164 The amalgamation of paganism with Christianity, from which its soul and beauty had departed, could not bring about an improvement of the moral conditions of the Romans. On the other hand, it produced a great outburst of monasticism, which was perhaps a more painful era in the moral history of mankind than the former extravagance of sensuality. This atrocious and sordid routine of self-torture played a large part in the spread of materialism and Imlejungs in Europe, and we will, therefore, study it here at some length. The rise the vestiith progress of monasticism is difficult today even to imagine the intensity and rapidity of the progress of the monastic movement in Europe. On account of the extreme inaccuracy of the historians of the movement, it is not easy to speak confidently of the actual number of hermits. The following facts may, however, be helpful in obtaining an idea of its great popularity. It is stated that in the days of St. Jerome, nearly 50,000 monks used to assemble at the Easter festivals, that were, in the 4th century, nearly 5,000 monks under a single abbot, that St. Seraphim had roo monks under him, and that towards the dose of Rhe 4th century the monastic population in a great part of Egypt was nearly equal to the population of the cities. For 200 years the maceration of the body was considered to be the highest proof of moral excellence. St. Macarius of Alexandria is said to have slept for 6 months in a marsh, exposing Lu's body to the stings of venomous flies. He would carry around with him 80 pounds of iron. His disciple, Eusebius, carried 150 pounds of iron, and lived for 3 years in a dried-up well. Another famous saint, named John, is said to have stood in prayer for 3 years, leaning occasionally on a rock to rest his weak limbs. Some hermits discarded their clothes and crawled on all fours, licked beasts covered only by their matted hair. Some lived in the deserted dens of wild beasts, others preferred dried-up wells, others dwelt among the tombs. One sect of monks lived solely on grass. Cleanliness of the body was regarded as pollution of the soul, and the saints who were most admired became a hideous mass of filth. St. Athanasius related how St. Anthony had never, until E.A.1 reared old age, been guilty of washing his feet. St. Abraham, who lived for 50 years after his conversion to Christianity, scrupulously avoided washing either his hands or his feet from that date. Abbot Ijexander used to say, looking mournfully back at the past, "Our fathers never washed their faces, but we frequent the public baths." Hermits, disguised as religious teachers, roamed about from place to place seducing children for their order. The control of parents over I-12 Islam and the world rare children was broken. Those children who forsook their parents and became monks were held in high public esteem. Hat was lost in obedience by the father was gained in prestige by the priest. The eloquence of St. Ambrose is reported to have been so seductive that mothers used to lock up their children to guard them against his charisma. The inroads made by monasticism into the family domain were exceedingly damaging. Social ticks were rent apart and the foundations of family life shaken. Domestic virtues were cast into discredit. It is hard to visualize the hard-heartedness of the hermits towards those who were bound to them by the closest earthly ties. The saints broke the hearts of rare mothers with ingratitude and abandoned their own wives and children. Their business was to save their own souls, they were not concerned with what befall their families. The Hemwanites ran away from the shadow of a woman. It was sinful to converse even with one's mother, wife, or sister. Their lifelong penances were all for nothing if they happened to meet a woman in the street or let her shadow fall upon them. This undoing of domestic life had a disastrous effect on people's character. Personal virtues such as courage, generosity, frankness, and cordiality were discouraged and sometimes utterly destroyed. The consequences of monasticism. It would be foolish to assume that such excessive asceticism and self-denial succeeded, in any measure, to counteract the grotesque licentiousness and materialism of the Romans. The moral and religious history of mankind does not warrant such optimism. It is opposed to human nature. Experience shows that only an ethical or spiritual system which is not opposed to innate human aims and instincts and which, instead of quenching them, succeeds in disciplining them and elevating them from the bestial to the noble, can tame arrogant materialism and convert it into a healthy social force. This is the method of Islam, the way of the Prophet Muhammad. We have noticed how Rhe Arabs were both chivalrous and warlike in the rise of the Vestra temperament. The Prophet did not attempt to tone down or suppress their valor. He diverted it from mutual warfare and senseless blood feuds to aim it in the way of Allah. Similarly, the Prophet did not try to stifle their inborn generosity and high-mindedness. He put these virtues to their best advantage by advising his followers to employ them for bringing relief to the needy and the forlorn instead of allowing them to branch out towards ostentation and self-conceit. He wove the indigenous characteristics of the Arabs into the fabric of Islam. He taught his religion as a new theory of life, giving to mankind something more wholesome and more divine for whatever he took away from it. He even allowed for times of amusement and recreation. As the great Muslim scholar, Hafiz Ibn Taymiyyah, has said, man agrees to give up a thing only when he is provided with a substance thereof, tens and that, prophets are raised up to evolve and to improve human nature, and not to change it. 166 These truths are underlined in the teachings of the Prophet Mujahideen by innumerable instances. When the Prophet arrived in Medina, he found that the 1v1 had two festivals a year in which they indulged in merrymaking. He inquired about the nature of the festivals and was told that the L1 had been celebrating them from Ve1y early times. Then he said, God has given you better festivals than these, Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr. R67 Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, relates on an Eid day to a 115 AR girls were singing the songs of the Battle of Duaydh at my house. They were not professional singers. Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, chanced to pay a visit at that moment. What, he exclaimed, the devil's songs in the Prophet's house? Thereupon the Prophet said to him, Abflow b1kr, every community has its Eid day of rejoicing. It is our Eid today. 168 Roman Christianity, on the contrary, took upon itself the utterly hopeless task of trying to alter human nature and tried to work out a system that was beyond human endurance. In the beginning people accepted it as a sort of recoil from the abundant materialistic inclinations of pre-Christian Rome, but they soon tired of it with the consequence for Isl.m and the worry that there came to exist in the Christian world two parallel and diametrically opposed movements of licentiousness and asceticism. There was no scarcity of moral enthusiasm, but it was drawn away into the desert, and the cities presented a scene of depravity and degradation that seldom been surpassed. Says Lecky. The level of public men was extremely depressed. The luxury of the court, the servility of the courtiers, and the prevailing splendor of dress and of ornament had attained an extravagant height. The world grew accustomed to a dangerous alternatio 11 of extreme asceticism and gross vice and, sometimes, as in the case of Antioch, the most vicious and luxurious cities produced the most numerous anchorites hermits. There existed a combination of vice and superstition which is eminently prejudicial to nobility, though not equally detrimental to the happiness of man. Public opinion was so low that very many forms of vice attracted little condemnation and punishment, while und belief in the absolving delicacy of superstitious rites calmed the imagination and allayed the terrors of conscience. There was more falsehood and treachery than under the Caesars, but there was much less cruelty, violence and shamalisms, There was also less public spirit, less independence of character, less intellectual freedom. 109 Corruption of the clergy. Gradually, the corruption of the monastic movement reached classes and institutions which appeared the most holy. The agape, or love feasts, which were regarded as symbols of Christian unity, became scenes of drunkenness, and not until they were finally suppressed by the government in the 7th century, the commemoration of martyrs degenerated into scandalous waste. High prelates were charged with flagrant breaches of morality. St. Jerome complained that the banquets, the rise of the Vestra 5 of many bishops eclipsed in splendor those of the provincial governors. Religious attacts were obtained by Krieg, benefices, dispensations, licenses, absolutions, indulgences, and privileges were bought and sold like merchandise. Pope Innocent VIII pawned the papal tiara. Of Leo X it was said that he squandered the revenues of 3 popes, he wasted the savings of his predecessor, spent his own income, he anticipated that of his successor. 17 It was affirmed that all of the revenues of France were insufficient to meet the expenditures of the popes. In short, the history of the Church and the papacy was the detailed daberation of the following Quranic Vene 0 Yehu Hilawi. L1. Many c. F. The Givishral L1 is and the Christian monks devour the wealth of mankind wal tunli and debar men from the way of Allah. Al-Ta'aba 934 The struggle between the Church and the State in the 8th century third ensued a bitter and most uninspiring struggle between the Church and the State. That Pope had the better of the Emperor d11 ring that initial rounds of the encounter, and the power of the Church was so greatly increased that, in RN 77, Pope Hildebrand ordered King Henry IV to come and submit to him, and Henry, realizing the Pope's non-news power, felt obliged to undertake the journey all the way to Canossa in bitter cold and in the humiliating circumstances. Barefoot, and clad in the penitent's shirt, he knocked at the castle gate, and it was only after much persuasion that Pope condescended to let him in and beg forgiveness. This, fortunes fluctuated between the Church and the State, sometimes the Pope won and sometimes the Emperor, until, after hundreds of years of confusion and bloodshed, the Church conceded defeat. During this period of CONF 11 CT, the people in the whole of Christendom were forced to endme the double tyranny of religion and politics, of the Church and the State. II-6 Islam al-Id The world misuse of power by the Church. The Church, during the Middle Ages, enjoyed far more power than the Roman emperors, and had it wanted it could have contributed immensely to the cause of European civilization. Had not the sovereign pontiffs been so completely occupied with maintaining their emoluments and temporalities in Italy, they might have made the whole continent advance like one man. Their officials could pass without difficulty into every nation, and communicate without embarrassment with each other, from Ireland to Bohemia, from Daly to Scotland. The possession of a common tongue gave them the administration of international affairs with intelligent allies everywhere, speaking same language. R71 But the guardians of the Church failed in their duty. They misused their power and opportunities and allowed things to deteriorate from bad to worse. The well-being of Cymries is generally portrayed in the variations of their populations. Judging from this, we find that in 500 years the population of England could scarcely double itself, while TL1E population of Europe, as a whole, could not do so even at the end of 1,000 years. This was, no doubt, due, to so 111e extent, to the practice of celibacy, but, in the main, it was the result of bad food, wretched clothing, inadequate shelter, personal uncleanliness, absence of physicians, and the popularity of shrine cures, in which society was encouraged by the clergy to put its trust. It was the policy of the Church to discourage the physician and his art, for the Church profited from the gi1h it received and the profits of the shrines. Consequently, epidemic diseases were permitted to spread over the continent unchecked. Aeneas Sylvium, who traveled in Britain in Q30, left a graphic description of the all-pervading ignorance, superstition, poverty, and want that held sway over that country. The rise of the Msti-7 pollution of the scriptures. The biggest and most fatal error the clergymen committed was that they incorporated in the Holy Scriptures all the prevailing notions of geography and physics. Those notions were by no means the limits of human knowledge, which is essentially progressive. Perhaps the clergymen did so in good faith to raise the merit of the SC1 Iptures in popular estimation, but its consequences were most certainly disastrous. That started a violent conflict between Christianity and science, in which Christianity, which had already suffered in its purity through dogmatic corruption, was overcome and the prestige of the clergyman was undermined forever. Christianity in Europe fell into disfavor, never to rise again in public estimation. Worst of all, Europe turned atheist. The Church, having established itself as the sole depository and controller of knowledge, was always ready to resort to civil power to compel obedience to its decisions. Thus, there evolved, under the name of Christian topography, a complete system of geography which had no divine sanction, and those who refused to accept it were declared heretics. The struggle between religion and science and tyranny of the Church meanwhile, owing to Islamic and Muslim scientific influences, the volcano of knowledge erupted in Europe. Its thinkers and scientists broke the chains of intellectual slavery. They boldly refuted the religious theories, which were based on preposterous evidence, and proclaimed the results of their own investigations. The Church authority reacted ruthlessly. It established the Inquisition to discover, and bring to book, the heretics lurking in towns, houses, cellars, caves and fields. This institution performed its duty with such savage alacrity that a Christian theologian exclaimed that it was hardly possible for a man to be a Christian and die in his bed. It is estimated that between 148 and 1801 the Inquisition punished 340,000 people, nearly 32,000 of whom were burnt in Islam and the world alive, including the great scientist, Bruno, whose only crime was that he taught the plurality of the worlds. Bruno was delivered to the secular authorities to be punished, as mercifully as possible, and without the shedding of blood, which, in fact, was the horrible formula for burning a prisoner at the stake. Galileo, another scientist of no less worth, was remorselessly punished till he did die in prison for having held the view that, contrary to the scriptures, the earth moved around the sun. The revolt at last, the patience of the genius of Europe was hosted, and it openly rose in revolt against the representatives of Christianity and its traditions. Provoked by the intellectual stagnation of the clergy, and the heinous atrocities perpetrated by the Inquisition, the enlightened sections among the Europeans developed a strong aversion to all knowledge, morality, and truth associated with the Church and religion in general. They could not help connecting religion with all the misdeeds of the papacy and the brutal Sufisms of the secular scholars. A dismal disbelief crept over the continent. Freed from their former serfdom under our Christianity, the peoples of Europe began to exhibit a definite intolerance of every kind of spiritual control. Thus, what had originally started as a tussle between Christianity and secular knowledge, flared up into an all-out contest between religion and progress. It was concluded arbitrarily by the intelligentsia of Europe that religion and science were altogether incompatible and, consequently, for the advancement of science it was necessary to discourage religion. It was no doubt a mistaken notion to pitch science against religion in general instead of against Christianity alone, but there were attenuating circumstances for this mistake. Precipitancy of the intellectuals did not have either the patience nor the understanding to distinguish between true religion and its self-appointed leaders. They did not care to ponder, calmly and impartially, on who really was the rise of the H7sti9 responsible for the tragedy, the teachings of religion or the ignorance and bigotry of the priests, and if it were the latter, how far justifiable it was to condemn religion for the sins of its so-called OFFICHIAC. They also did not possess the broad-mindedness and the genuine thirst for truth which might have led them to a dispassionate study of Islam, although it had, by that time, grown to be the faith of a number of powerful neighboring nations. Islam could have easily provided a straight and simple answer to their intellectual and spiritual difficulties by breaking the gloom of scholastic theology of the Middle Ages and liberating their spirit from the shackles of darkness. It could have announced the dawn of better things by granting full freedom to the natural urges and legitimate cravings of the mind and body without, for a moment, failing to prohibit what was base and wicked. Says the Holy Quran, for he the Prophet commands them what is just 11:11. Forbids them what is evil, he allows them as lawful what is good and pure and prohibits them from what is bad and impure, he releases them from their heckle 1. Why imradens and from the yokes tliatare upon them. The racial prejudice of the Europeans also stood in the way. The barriers of hatred erected by the Crusadas between the Christians and the Muslims, and the resulting ill will of the Christian missionaries did a lot to entrench the antagonistic attitude of the West towards Islam. Part of the blame should, however, also be laid at the door of Muslim preachers, for they sadly neglected the opportunity of making such an important continent as Europe acquainted with the message of Islam, though all the resources of mighty empires were at their disposal. Western materialism. In this spiritual vacuum, Europe took a tragic turn. It descended by degrees into the depths of materialism. Its social thinkers and scientists 122. And the world investigated the nature of the world and of life as if there were no absolute power which created them and ruled over them according to some plan and purpose without itself being subject to any, av.rs. They interpreted the material universe and its manifestations along mechanical lines and called it objective and scientific method. Rejecting as slavery to tradition whatever was based on belief in the existence of God. One by one, they disowned everything that existed apart from matter and energy, everything that was not realizable in experience, or could not be weighed and measured. For a long time the Europeans did not openly reject the notion of God. All Europeans are not atheists, even today, but the intellectual and moral position they had adopted definitely precluded all claim of religion upon life. Attempts were made after the Renaissance to produce a reconciliation between religion and science, as some sort of religious arrangement was thought necessary to preserve the tranquility of society by influencing the social relations of men. But the pace set by neo-realistic civilization was so hot that religion could not stand it. It also emailed a good deal of inconvenience to keep materialism in harmony with transcendental truths. As decades and centuries advanced, the ceremony was waived, and much of Europe took unconditionally to the worship of matter. Significantly enough, there appeared at that time a number of outstanding social and political writers and teachers who indiscriminately sowed the seeds of materialism in the minds of people and laid emphasis on the sensuous enjoyment and the mystic views of morality. Machiavelli paved the way by divorcing politics from ethics and prescribing a dual standard of morality, one private and the other public. If religion must exist, he taught, let it be confined to the personal sector offlafo. It was none of its business to intrude into politics. The state was a law unto itself. The subject matter of Christianity was the other world, it had nothing to do with the world in which man lived. The state had no use for the religious, for their religiousness often acted to its detriment and prevented them from disregarding the basis of morality in the hour of its need. Princes and officials of the state, it nte rise o the T-Vest 121 was believed, should be ready to take course to deceit, falsehood, and treachery in the pursuit of national objectives. These philosophers and writers played havoc with the standards and values of religion. They made fun of the ancient notions of religious morality and, after presenting sin in a highly fascinating light, invited people to give free rein to their appetites. Western civilization reverted to its origins. It became merely a new edition of the pagan civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome. All aspects of these ancient civilizations, that were subdued under the influence of Oriental Christianity, were revived by the rural craftsmen of the 19th century. The same lack of spiritual feeling, the same inability to believe had characterized the religions of the Greeks and the Romans, is apparent in the religious makeup of the modern West. The same extravagance of sensuality that vast prevalent in the cultural fabric of Greece and Rome is exhibited fully in Western civilization today. The soul of the modern Western young man is no different from the soul of the democratic young man of ancient Greece as portrayed by Plato in his Republic, insofar as he regards himself entitled to indulge in the gratification of his desires. Christianity, or materialism. The real religion of the West today, the religion that rules over its mind and spirit, is not Christianity but materialism. Says the author of Islam at the Crossroads. No doubt, there are still many individuals in the West who hopeful and think in a religious way and make the most desperate efforts to reconcile their beliefs with the spirit of their civilization, but they are exceptions only. The average Occidental, be he a Democrat or a fascist, a capitalist or a Bolshevik, a mule worker or an intellectual, has only one positive religion, and that is the worship of material progress, the belief that there is no other goal in life than to make life continually easier. 22 Islam and the world are, as the current expression goes, independent of nature. The temples of this religion are the gigantic factories, cinemas, chemical laboratories, dancing halls, hydroelectric works, and its priests are bankers, engineers, film stars, captains of industry, finance magnates. The unavoidable result of this arrowing after power and pleasure is the creation of hostile groups armed to the teeth and determined to destroy one another whenever and wherever their respective interests come to a clash. And on the cultural side, the result is the creation of a human type whose morality is confined to the question of practical utility alone, and whose highest criterion of good and evil is material success. 172 Professor C.E.M. Jode cites the following incident as symptomatic of the growing malady of religious disbelief among the young men and women of Europe. Recently asked a group of 20 students, young men and women for the most part in their early 20s, how many of them were, in any sense of the word, Christian. Only 3 said that they were, 7 had never thought about the matter one way or the other, while the remaining 10 were belligerently anti-Christian. I saw no reason to suppose that the proportion of believers to non-believers indicated by these replies is untypical. Yet 50 or even 20 years ago it would assuredly have been different. Canon Barry's conviction that a Christian revival on a large scale can save the world seems, then, to be shared by a diminishing number of persons, and I can see no reason why Mon Barry should think his opinion to be true, except such as is afforded by his wish that it may be true. Now wishes may forth our thoughts, but they do not breed evidence. I return, then, to the opinion 1 Jade Rise cf the West. Pressed at the beginning of this article that, so far as present indications go, the Christian Church in this country will, in another 100 years, he to all intents and purposes, dead. Since Christianity is our theme, it will be well to conclude with a parable. Take it from the daily paper 123. A fortune is being made by a man of 77 who, after 16 years of self-imposed poverty, living on a week, has invented and patented a method of turning old Bibles into gun cotton, artificial silk, cellulose, and expensive notepaper. IES machinery has already been installed at a Cardiff factory. And at 8 others in various parts of the country where modern armaments are being reneged from ancient testaments. I.e. that hath car to hear may hear. 173 In another book, Jode says for centuries England has been dominated by the gospel of acquisition. Money talks, and the desire it has for 200 years past been a greater spur to effort than all other incentives added together. For money buys possessions, and by the number and grandeur of his possessions a man's merit is chiefly E5 timid. Politics, literature, the cinema, the radio, even on occasions TB pulpit, have poured forth year after year a stream of propaganda devoted to convincing their readers and seers and listeners that a society in which acquisitiveness is the most highly developed of the mystics is a civilized society. The veneration of money assorts oddly with our profession of a religion which assures us not only that poverty is good and riches are evil, but that a rich man has as poor a chance of eternal happiness as the poor man. I-24 Islam and the world has a good one. Nevertheless, though the dictates of prudence no less than the exhortations of religion unite in recommending poverty to those who would serve God and go to heaven, people have shown no disposition to act as if the exhortations of religion were true, and have been willing and eager to barter their chance of celestial bliss in the future for a sufficiency of worldly goods in the present. Perhaps they have believed that they could make one, best of both worlds, and by the timeliness of a deathbed repentance, secure for themselves as much consideration in the next world as their bank balances have obtained for them in this one. Implicitly their view would seem to be that XLJ rest by Samuel Butler in LNS notebooks. It is all very well for mischievous writers to maintain that we cannot serve God and Mammon. Granted that it is not easy, but nothing that is worth doing is ever easy. Why? Whatever we may be in theory, most of us demonstrate by our practice that we are convinced but cryans. So strong indeed is our addiction to wealth, so confirmed our belief that it is wealth which, above all other things, confers merit upon a man and greatness upon a state, that it has succeeded in inspiring two theories of the greatest historical importance with regard to the nature of the motive force which makes the wheels of the world go round. One of these, laissez-faire economics, dominated in the 19th century. It asserted that men would always act in the way which they considered v.round conduce to their greatest economic advantage, that, in short, they were inspired by a hedonism not of the passions, but of the pocket. The other, which bids fair to dominate the early part of the 20th century, is Marx's theory of economic determinism, which insists 711 e Risiol Thuist 125 that the way in which, at any given moment, a society organizes its economic system to satisfy its material needs, its arts, its ethic, its religion, and even its logic, no less than its form of government. Doth these theories derive their greatest plausibility from the value which men and women demonstrably place upon wealth as a criterion of merit in individuals and a sign of greatness in states? 74 God-forgetfulness. In the Quran it is said of idolaters and polytheists that they cry out to God for help in adversity. The godless materialists of the West have lost themselves so completely in material self-satisfaction that it would be futile to expect any such thing from them. And the words of the Holy Quran and most Mreli Lve sent apostles w many nalium bfim the and we ajud them with s1, ffE1 in 5 and 1 dvwitty that they might learn, bumali. Vf, and the s1, Ferry 11g reached them from us, why did they not the practice humility? On the contrary, their hearts became hardened and Satan made their sinfi 1l acts seem one luring to them. Al and M6P3 and MJST surely VVE inflicted P1111 Islamiant on then 1, B11T they humbled RWT themselves 11CS to their Lord, nor did they subn 1 Isioli entreat 1 him 1 Almumim 1 N23 in times of deep crisis or distress as, for example, in a war, one does not find any trace of religious fear or respect. The intellectual and moral leaders of the West exult in this and call it courage and resoluteness. In the eyes of a Muslim, however, it is sheer spiritual apathy. 126 Islam Act the World an Indian in London in I-940-41, when the Nazi air offensive was at its peak, painted a graphic picture of the air raids of those days under the caption "A Night in London" in the following words: being tired of persistent air raids during the last several days and nights, we were engaged that night in making preparations for a rather lavish Indian English dinner. The landlady had generously placed the kitchen at our disposal, and the big room on the upper story had been converted into a ballroom. There were about 25 us in all, both men and women. We did the cooking together. After the meal over, we began to dance. Then, all of a sudden, the AJR raid siren was heard. At first a hush fell over us. What now? One of us asked without interrupting his dance. Carry on, a girl said. And we carried on till, not to speak of the home, the whole locality began to ring with our songs and laughter. 175 later in the book he says after a few days, it became a regular practice that the siren went up at about 7 or 8 p.m. The drone of the enemy planes was heard, the searchlights wove a blazing pattern in the sky and the guns began to boom. If a cinema show happened to be in progress, it used to be stopped for a while and it was flashed on the screen that the air raid has started, but the picture will continue. For those who wish to take shelter, the passage to the left goes down into the basement air. But no one moved from his seat, and the picture was resumed. Apart from the modern West, such things could only happen in ancient Greece and Rome. It is said that when the city of Pompeii was 71 i.e. rise of the West E27 destroyed by the volcano, Vesuvius, it was daytime and the citizens were enjoying gladiatorial games in the amphitheater when clouds of wet ashes and lava began to descend. Many of them were burned to death in their seats, and many more were killed in the stampede that followed. Only those were saved who were lucky enough to get away in boats in time. The city lay buried under its lava bed for 800 years. It was dug out by excavators in the 19th century to serve as a womb to the world. Says the Holy Quran, or else, did the people of the towns feel cernra against the coming of our wrath in lirrowed daylight while they played abgharat carefree? How different is the case in such situations of Goel-fearing people can be imagined from the following verse 0 Yehu believe, when ye meet a force, be firm, and call God in remembrance much and affian that ye may prosper. Al-Anfal 845 The companions of the Holy Prophet related that, whenever a distressing circumstance confronted the Prophet, he at once stood up for prayer. When the Battle of Iladr was fought, the Prophet marshaled his troops, and then he retired to his camp and gave himself up to prayer. O God, he exclaimed again and again, O God, if these believers are destroyed, no one will he left on the earth to worship thee. Nr 76 An Easterner's view. One Eastern writer and scholar, Abd or Rajaman Kawakabai, made a penetrating character study of Western men in the following passage: I-28 Ili.m, and the world Westerner is stubborn, hard-hearted and materialistic. He is malicious, selfish, and vindictive. It would appear that nothing of the lofty idealism of Oriental Christianity is now left with him. Take, for instance, the German. You will find him dry and rude. He believes that the weak has no right to exist. Power is the sole criterion of greatness with him, and the source of all power is wealth. Learning he does value, honor he does admire, but only for the sake of the wealth they bring in. The Greek and the Italian are selfish and libertine by nature. With them, intellect means freedom, life means shamelessness, and prestige means the capacity to show off and to domineer. R77 Materialism. In spiritualism, materialism has so ceaselessly absorbed the attention and the will of Western people that even their spiritual activities are tinged with it. The modern movement for investigating the spiritualistic phenomena and holding communication with the dead is wholly materialistic in its conception. It is being worked out as a material science and an industrial enterprise. Unlike Islamic spiritualism or Eastern mysticism, it has nothing to do with spiritual uplift with things like self-purification, piety, and preparation for the afterlife. All the endeavors in the West, thus, are guided solely by considerations of power, pride and glory. The idea of divine approval has no place in their calculations, while it is the very basis of a Muslim's thought and action. A civilization of the Western type can only be a deadly poison for those human values held dear by a Muslim. A thing to be proud of in the West is something to be shunned by a follower of Islam. Says the Holy Quran, "Say, shall we tell you those who lost most in respect of their deeds, those whose efforts have won ec11 wasted in this life, while the thought their works to be an high judgment? They are those the rise of Thuist 129 who deny the signs of their Lord and the faa of their having to meet him in Grift 1. Vain will be their works, nor shall vve, on the day qf judgment, ijfem any weight." Al-Kaf 18:103-5 and L shall turn to whatever deeds they did in this life, and vve shall make sud one deeds as floating dust scattered about. Al-Furqan 25:23 Once the Prophet was asked who among the following three persons would be considered a fighter in God's way: a man who fought under the impulse of his strength, or the one who fought in defense of his honor, or the other who fought for fame. The Prophet replied that a war in God's way is the one which is waged to make God's word dominant. Those who were conscious of the real importance of this took great pains to conceal their virtuous and kindly deeds from public knowledge, and even then they were haunted by a constant fear of hypocrisy. It was a favorite prayer of Umar, "May Allah be pleased with him, O God, make all my acts pure, let them be for thy sake alone, and allow not anyone bide thee to have a share in them." Economic pantheist Karl Marx is one example of the total immersion of the Wisdom mind I11 materialism. ILE developed the doctrine of class struggle to maintain that all history v.ras merely the result of economic conditions, under whose influence all other life phenomena had received form and imprint. He recognized only the economic aspect of human existence, denying the validity of other factors such as religion, ethics, soul, and intellect. I11 wars of history, he said, all insurrections and revolutions, were nothing but the endeavors of the smaller and the emptier stomach to have its revenge on the larger and the fuller one. Even religious wars, one could justifiably conclude from this, were caused by economic motives, and those who waged them were moved by no 130, slam ennial world higher sentiment than to establish a better order of production and distribution of wealth. This economic pantheism recognizes no holy wars, no religious endeavors, and no spiritual movements. Nothing exists except sex and hunger. The outlook on life in the East being basically spiritualistic. There have been instances of mystics raising the cry of nothing exists but God in moments of spiritual ecstasy. The spirit of the West is dominated by materialism. When its thinkers are in an exalted state, they reject everything that does not have a direct bearing on economic materialism and cry out nothing exists but sex and hunger. The mystics of the East regarded man as the shadow of God upon earth. Overwhelmed by this notion, some declared, "I am God." Conversely, the materialists of the West do not credit man with anything higher than an animal existence. The Darwinian theory of evolution in the I9th century, conclusions were arrived at Europe which encouraged an animal approach to human problems. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his The Origin of Species to show that man was an evolved animal who had attained his present form after passing through various stages, including those of the amoeba on the lowest and of the ape on the other end of the scale in the long process of life Sevol Mayan. The book caught the attention of the whole of Europe. It revolutionized the scientific approach to man's problems, and gave powerful support to the view that the universe was functioning without the direction or supervision of a supernatural power, there being nothing behind its visible framework except the soulless law of nature. In the words of C.E.M. Jode Lt is difficult for us to realize the sense of shock with which the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, and the evidence upon which his conclusions were based, afflicted our fathers. Darwin had shown, or at least was the rise of the West thought to have shown, that the process of life's evolution upon this planet had been continuous from its earliest beginnings in the amoeba and the jellyfish right up to its most highly developed forms. We were its most highly developed forms. Therefore the process of development from the amoeba to ourselves was continuous and unbroken. Now the Victorians had been led to believe that man was a special creation, that he was, in fact, a degenerate angel, whereas if Dr. were right, he was only a promoted ape. R7813 In spite of the awkward predicament in which the Darwinian theory placed mankind, and its conceptual and historical fallacies, it made a deep impression on the Western mind, probably because the Western mind had already been brought into a receptive state. Nudism and other Wisdom movements for a return to nature are all the direct consequences of the view that man is, after all, an elevated animal. The growth of nationalism. It has already been pointed out that a narrow national feeling, racial prejudice, and an exaggerated regard for geographical division are the characteristics of the Western mind, which has been transmitted steadily from one generation to another. Although by the time Christianity arrived in Europe, when the teachings of Jesus Christ had become changed, they still bore the imprint of the great master and carried within them the characteristics of a revealed religion. No religion, however debased it may be, can ever allow the barriers of race or color to be erected within the organic unity of humanity. It had, therefore, striven to unite the different nations of Europe into a SMGK family under the protection of the Church. But when Martin Luther started the Reformation in the R6th century and unscrupulously made use of German nationalism as a major weapon in his fight against the Church, the unifying force that held together the various peoples in Christendom was broken and they began to be increasingly separated 132 Islamidthe world from one another. The weaker the hold of Christianity became, the stronger grew the influence of nationalism in Europe, as if Christianity and nationalism were the two sides of a balance. The more one of them went up, the more the other came down. As Lord Lothian stated, Europe once had the same kind of cultural and religious unity as India in the earlier days of Christianity. But when in the 15th century the new learning of the Renaissance and the new movement for religious reform known as the Reformation began, because it had no constitutional unity, Europe fell into pieces and has since then remained divided imo those national sovereign states whose strife and wars are not only the men of Europe itself but the principal threat to the peace of the world. Furthermore, he says the decline in the authority of religion, the indispensable guide of man, the one source which can give more purpose and nobility and meaning to life of man, explains, at least in part, why the Western world has given its allegiance in the recent decades to new political gospels based on race or class, or has pinned its faith on a form of science which admittedly is almost wholly concerned with advance in the material plane, with making life more rather than less expensive and complicated. It explains, also in part, why Europe finds it so difficult to attain to that unity in spirit and life which would enable it to rise above the spirit of exclusive and militant nationalism which is its principal bane today. 79 Immediately, then, Europe built a barrier between itself and the rest of the world, with the nations that fell on its side of the barrier constituting the elite of humanity. It was completely in conformity the rise of the Vilestra 33 with the practice of the ancient Greeks and Romans who regarded only themselves as civilized and everybody else, and particularly those living to the east of the Mediterranean, as barbarians. Separate worlds. The nationalist states of Europe have organized themselves imo many separate worlds, walled in by the frontiers of politics, race, and geography. They have made gods of themselves and demanded the same adoration and loyalty from their citizens as is due to the Creator alone. They are above and beyond everything. All living and dying must be for them alone. Need be. Lives must be blindly sacrificed at their altars. To every nationalist his own state is God's most noble creation on earth and all else is rubbish. Nationalism brings forth the same fruit everywhere. It is impossible for a people to be imbued with nationalism and not have an aggressive nature. The leadership of such peoples invariably passes into the hands which know of no religious or moral control and have no object before them other than the enhancement of national prestige. In such states the recollection of vanished glory and past greatness is shamelessly employed to feed the nation's conceit, and philosophy, literature, and even the physical sciences are converted into instruments for strengthening the national will. Hatred and fear are the essential ingredients of modern nationalism. To arouse the national sentiment in a people it is necessary to provide them with something they can hate and someone they can fear. Joad analyzed this so beautifully in the following passage: Now the emotions which most men have in common and which are, therefore, the most easily aroused, are those of hatred and fear. Is by such emotions and not by compassion, charity, generosity, or love that great masses of men are most easily moved. Those who wish to 134 Islam and the world rule the nation for whatever purpose, will do well to find something to hate, somebody to fear. If I really wanted to unite the nations of the modern world, I should invent for them an enemy in some other planet, or possibly on the moon. It is not surprising, then, that the nationalist states of the modern world should be chiefly guided by the emotions of hatred and fear in their dealings with their neighbors, since it is upon these emotions that their governors thrive, and by them that unity is strengthened. 1-8 Islam is against the philosophy of national separatism and selfishness, as it has no regard for truth and stands bluntly for my nation, right or wrong. In the structure of the Kur 3. Nick thought, considerations of descent or national adherence have no place. Islam rejects every alignment, friendship, or loyalty which has its source in national or party spirit. To illustrate this principle, the Prophet very pointedly said, "He is not one of us who proclaims the cause of tribal partisanship, and he is not one of us who fights in the cause of tribal partisanship, and he is not one of us who dies for the sake of tribal partisanship." 18 He who dies fighting for a national or partisan cause dies a heathen's death. 182 And is reported to have been declared by the Holy Prophet to be outside the pale of Islam. In Anath, Badath the Prophet is reported to have declared, "Whoever fights under a flag in support of a partisan cause or in answer to a call of a partisan cause or to help a partisan cause and is then killed, Rus death is a death in the cause of Ignora." 11 CE. I-83 Similarly, he who is killed while fighting under a flag supporting a partisan cause, or is killed in a fight in support of a partisan cause, is not one of my people. 184 Islam recognizes only two broad divisions of mankind, one the Rizif Thuist 13:5 comprising those who are the servants of God and the champions of truth, and the other comprising those who are followers of the devil and the champions of falsehood. Islam declares itself to be at war with all those who form the latter division. No matter to what nationality or race they belong, as enmity or warfare in Islam is not governed by national or political considerations, but by the considerations of truth and righteousness. The weaker nations, the supporters of nationalism, promote the sentiment of nationalism in the smaller and weaker nations until they begin to burst with national pride. Such nations develop on nationalist lines with no extraterritorial alignments. Ultimately, these nations are devoured by a greater power while the world looks on. The story of the destruction of the Central European nations in the last war is well known. It is much regretted that the countries of the Islamic world, which possess a message that cuts across the conventional divisions of politics and blood and is universal in its scope and possesses an ideology which is far more dynamic, are also being overcome with national feeling. It is doubtful if, weak and ill-equipped as these countries are, they will be able to survive an onslaught from outside. National prestige. The prestige of the modern nationalist states requires that they should hold under their sway large parts of the world, possess extensive sources of revenue and be in a position to enforce their will on neighboring states and to terrorize and overawe their rivals. In such states faithful citizens feel a false sense of pride in the superiority of their own culture and traditions, and they develop a contempt for the cultures and traditions of all other nations, and are ready and willing at all times to commit the most detestable crime, and barbaric acts at the bidding of their leaders. The moral caliber of such a nation may be extremely low, its citizens may be utterly devoid of moral sense and human dignity and may not be following any moral code. Yet such a nation is deemed fit to be respected as a great nation. Jode observed that 136 Islam and the world. National greatness and prestige mean in effect the wielding of sufficient power to enable one, if necessary, to enforce one's will upon others. The fact that the prestige of a nation has no relation to moral qualities should in itself constitute a sufficient condemnation of the ideal which nationalism enshrines. If a country merely tells the truth, its prestige is low. Prestige, in fact, depends upon what M.R. Baldwin has called the strength to command respect and attention, in other words, on high explosives and incendiary bombs, and the patriotic loyalty of the young men who will be willing to drop them on cities and civilian populations. Thus the prestige for which a nation is admired stands for precisely the reverse of the qualities for which an individual is admired. This being so, the possession of prestige should, I suggest, disqualify a power from being considered civilized in proportion to the amount of prestige possessed. It is not admirable to be able to command respect by the power of blackernay. 185 Enlightenment or trade. Godless states are, in fact, trade societies or cartels whose real job is to extort, not to confer, benefits. They have no spiritual roots, no ethical ideals, and they are supremely unconcerned with the inner selves of their peoples and the welfare of humanity at large. Their attention is focused only on material gain. Whenever there is a clash between N1 orality and Econon 1 IC gain, these states will always give preference to the latter. Vulgar and immoral practices are not criminal offenses in such states. The duty of their law is to regulate evil, not to check it. Prostitution is, for example, a legal trade, usury is practiced by governments, gambling flourishes under respectable names, alcohol is freely available and the industry is extolled as a source of national wealth. Radio, cinema, and television function solely as an instrument of entertainment. Instead of the rise of the Western 37 educating the masses and refining them morally, it perverts their tastes and makes them frivolous. Official censorship is extremely sensitive where political or administrative interests are involved, but when it comes to ethical and moral questions, it becomes lethargic and accommodating. Pornographic and other worthless literature invades and plagues the public mind, but the machinery of government moves only rarely against it. Along with its morals, the health of the nation also plummets. Shops are flooded with spurious sex stimulants, pick-me-ups, preservers of youthful vigor and restorers of lost vitality. Their manufacturers remain at liberty by bribing government officials or by making lavish contributions to the funds of the party in power. All this happens because that pivot of state activity in these countries is not religion, but material prosperity. On the other hand, those states which have as their goal the teachings of the prophets of God operate as organizations for enlightenment and moral uplift. It is worth remembering that when a complaint was made to Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz that the revenues of the empire had decreased as a result of the reforms he had been sent into introduced, he retorted that the Holy Prophet the world as a guide and not as a tax collector. In that brief sentence, the Caliph summed up the entire philosophy of a religious state. In a religious state the stress lies on the moral and spiritual welfare of the people. Taxes and imposts have their value, but only as a means of promoting the true development of citizens and keeping the machinery of the state in good order. They have no other value. In such states political and economic questions are examined from the standpoint of religion, and no second thoughts are entertained about subordinating material interests to spiritual needs. Usury, gambling, adultery, fornication, and other perverse and shameless acts, along with their incentives and inducements, have no chance of making an appearance within their frontiers. All items of individual gain which are harmful to the larger interests of society are prohibited, regardless of the loss it may entail for the state coffers. Program 1es of reform in such states have an eye not only on the improvement of the outward conduct and on 138, Slam and the world raising the standard of living of the people, but also on improving their inner thoughts and impulses, because it is utterly impossible to improve the standards of behavior in a people and to create real happiness among them without inculcating proper moral sentiments. Thus, religious states place restrictions on all things that encourage unhealthy desires and and those as public enemies who incite licentiousness and sinfulness through art or industry. This is so because these states regard themselves not as policemen but as the guardians of people's morals and well-being. Says the Holy Quran Rn1ey1 those who, we establish them in the land, establish regular prayer and give regular charity, enjoin right and forbid wrong, with God rests the end and decision of all affairs. The difference between trade and ethics. The modern get-rich-quick age has inspired a fierce race for money-making, with the result that shops and stores are filled with fancy goods and gadgets irrespective of the purchasing capacity of the consumers or the social and moral effects on them. The shops present a brilliant spectacle of gam-1ns, shoes, and luxury goods of the latest designs. Then, suddenly, these things go out of fashion and their place is taken by new arrivals, most of which are, in fact, the same goods with a few alterations. Standards of prosperity and elegance change from day to day. The material arnenites offo keep on increasing, but this does not increase ease or happiness in life, as the cost of living, too, increases with greater speed. Hat was a comfortable income yesterday is totally insufficient today. Contentment has become a meaningless word. The soul of man is unhappy. The existing social environment demands everyone to consider it a religious obligation to attain the highest standard of living. One Odom man plunges into the task with all his heart, but when, after a lifetime of struggle, the goal seems to have come within the range of realization, it rises to a higher level. This has the rise of the West 139 reduced life to an absurd enterprise. The spirit of man is decaying. There is little lasting happiness or peace in the world. Homes which could have been havens of peace are virtual hell spots on earth due to the lack of this or that imaginary requisite of happiness. Is the above picture any different from that of ancient Rome? Scientific progress. There has been stupendous scientific and technological progress in modern times. We propose now to examine this progress from a different point of view, from the point of view of man, and see how far the environment which science and technology have succeeded in creating for him is suited to his us. The Islamic view. Muslims believe that the real purpose of science is to remove obstacles in the way of true development of man's personality by using the latent forces in nature in such a way as to broaden life and make it rich in all its aspects. In prehistoric times man traveled on foot. Then he learned to make use of the beasts of burden, later invented the cart. But man has a restless soul. He is never satisfied with his situation and is always striving to make himself more and more comfortable. As his needs multiplied, his standards of comfort and pace of life also changed. Better and quicker modes of transport were devised till the steamship replaced the sailing vessel on the sea, and marvels of speed and efficiency were invented for travel by land and air. If these inventions are used as a means to a good life, they are a blessing of God. The Holy Quran has described as a bounty from our Lord the advantage man enjoys over other creatures in travel. 4 and cattle he has created oil royal man, from them ye derive warmth, and numerous benefits, mid of their meat ye eat. And ye have a sema of beauty in them as ye drew them home in the evening, and as ye lead them forth to pasture in, he morning. 140 Islam until fi world and they carry your heavy loads fj lands th1t ye could not othcru eyes reach except with souls distressed, for your Lord is indeed one, highest kind, lfast iwersiful. And he lws created horse, mules, and donkeys for you to ride and se for show, and he has created oth one things of which ye ha no knowledge. Al-Nahl 16:5-8 We have honored the sons of Adam, and VVE have pro 1. Ded them 1. With transport on land and sea, and we have given them for sustenance things good and pure, and VVT have conferred on them special favors, above a great part of our creation. Al-Isra R 770 and it is that has created pairs in all things, and has made gru ships and cattle on which ye ride, in order that ye may sit firm on their backs, and when so seated, ye may celebrate the kind favor of your Lord, and say, Glory to him who has subjected these to our use, for we could never have accomplished this by ourselves, and to our Lord, surely, must we turn back. Zikra F43 R2Q and to Sulayman we mad, the wind obedient, its early mon 1 and j. Stride was a month's journey and its evening stride was a month's journey. Sabah 34:12 Then WT subjected the 11 ind to his power, to flow gently to his order, whithersoever he willed. There is a profound difference between the approach of a believer and that of a non-believer to these gifts. When a believer makes use of them, he does so with a strong feeling of humility, because he knows that it is only the mercy of God that has enslaved the free, high-spirited the rise animals and the inert steel and wood was helpless. Says the Holy Quran Toph Thuist 141 His will, Othvisk, he himself in order that ye may celebrate the kind favor of your Lord, and say, Glory to him who has subjected these to our use far we could ne11 have accomplished this li sef.es. Zikra F43:13 The believer also knows that there will come a day vd1 and he will be called on to answer for the uses to which he put his powers and opportunities. And to our Lord, surely, muslo we tum back Holy Quran, Zikra F43:14. The words of the Prophet Sulayman, Rt1 Tis is by the grace of my Lord, to test me whether I am ungrateful or one grateful. And if any is great 3, tmly his gratitude is a gain for his own so 11 but if any is ungrateful, indeed my Lord is free fall needs, supreme in honor. Holy Quran, Al-Naml 2t40 A believer makes the most appropriate use of his own capabilities and the power of Nadalra. He uses them in the path of faith, righteousness, and truth. One is the true purpose of their creation and, VE sent DC1W11 iron I11 which is material for I1 var, as well as many benefits for mankind that God may also test who it is that will help him, and his apostles, unseen, for God is Sarans, A1 Ishti. Holy Quran, Al-F Lauded 5:2 Lie who has faith in God and fears him can never be a supporter of wrong. In the words of Moses O my Lord, for that thou liast L1 stod ti1 y grow on me, neither shall I be one help to those who sin. Holy Quran Al-Qas 28:17. I-42 Islam and the world in short, trne faith alone teaches man not to be conceited or wasteful by impressing upon him that he is Anja the trustee and not the owner of the treasures that are lying scattered everywhere in the universe, the creator and Lord sovereign of them all being God alone, to whom he is responsible for the VE he exploits and makes use of them. The Holy Quran mentions a number of instances to emphasize the different attitudes adopted by godly and ungodly people in respect of worldly wealth. On the one hand, there is the Prophet Yusuf b1 daying into lofty words of gratitude at the height of his worldly glory. 0 My Lord, thou hast indeed bestowed on me some power, and ta'ed me something of the INTE 111 retation of dreams and events. 0 Toy, creator of the he 1 we 11s and the earth, 11 Who art my pre-rector in this world, 11 and D in the hereafter. Take 17 Woo my soul at death as one submitting to T 11 Y will as a IV Foslim and unite me with the RI1, Lunkus. Yusuf 12 Rand when Suleiman, 61 beheld his own resplendent majesty, the following words of thanksgiving sprang spontaneously from his pious lips. 0 My Lord, so order me that I nrnybi. Rate Phi, 4 Thyfm, ours, which thou hast bestowed on me and on my parents, and that I may work the righteousness tlwr will appoint one thee, and admit me, Li 711 Y grace. To the ranks of thy righteous servants. Al-Nam. 2I9 On the other hand, those who were devoid of faith when so overcome by their own power and wealth that they insolently refused to acknowledge anyone as superior to or more powerful than themselves. Ti1e Rise of the West. 43 Now the FD Lulawet arrogantly throw gh the land against all truth and reason, and said F. Viho is superior to us in strength. What? Did they not see that God, Vho treated them, was superior to Thrm high strength? But they continued to reject our signs. Fu Ilat 41:15 One such man was Karfmkora, who was one of the richest men of Anseat NT times. When his people said to him Exult 1101 For God oveth not those of 10 exult in riches. Busik, with the wealth which God has bestowed on thee, the home FTL1e Hirashter, not your getting thy portion in this world, but do thou good, as God loot been good to thee, and seek not occasions. G.1 R missed 1 Ephi 11 The land, for God loved th1wt those who do mischief. He replied that high riches were the fruits of his own labor and intelligence, and he was not indebted to anyone. The consciousness of one's own powers and the haughty denial of the eternal, the supreme, as having authority over man and nature alike breed a madness which no canons of morality and no considerations of humanitarianism can control or cure. Foot is really and tmly essential to the growth of peace and happiness that knowledge, power, and wealth should be rigidly kept under the ceaseless control of religion. The disparity between power and morality since the Renaissance, the conquest of the material world has been extremely rapid, and the spiritual world has fallen into oblivion with an almost equal rapidity. This has given rise to a generation that looks almost superhuman insofar as its power over matter is concerned, but is not very much superior to the beasts when judged with reference to its own inner state. With all the means of a good life at its command, it 144 Islam, and the world does not know how to live. It is narrow and selfish. It cannot distinguish between the primary and the secondary qualities of things, and is unworthy of the power it has come to acquire over matter. In the words Ophiode, science has given NS powers fit for the gods, and to their use we bring the mentality of schoolboys and savages. 186 Jode says further, this contrast between the marvels of our scientific achievements and the ignorance of our social childishness meets us at every turn. He can talk across continents and oceans, wire pictures, install television sets and satellite dishes in homes, listen in salon to rig Ben striking in London, ride above and beneath the earth and the sea. Children can talk along wires, typewriters are silent, teeth filling painless, liners have swimming baths, crops are ripened by electricity, roads are made of rubber, X-rays are the windows through which we view our insides, photographs can speak and sing, murderers can be tracked down by wireless, hair is waved by electric current, submarines go to the North Pole, aeroplanes to the South. Yet, we cannot, in the midst of our enormous cities, provide a little space where poor children rmght play in comfort and safety. As an Indian philosopher once said to me. Yes, you can fly in the air like birds and swim in the sea like fishes, but how to walk upon the earth you do not yet know. 18:7 Commenting in the same vein on the catastrophic results of the non-nous advantages gained by the sciences of inanimate matter over those of living things, another Western writer, Alexis Carrel, the Nobel Prize-winning French surgeon, observes in truth, modern life has set them people free. It incites them to acquire wealth by any and every means, the rise of the West provided that these means do not lead them to jail. It allows them to frequent excitation and the easy satisfaction of their sexual appetites. 1T does away with constraint, discipline, effort, everything that is inconvenient and laborious. 188 And again, modern civilization seems to be incapable of producing people endowed with imagination, intelligence, and courage. In practically every country there is a decrease in the intellectual and moral caliber of those who carry the responsibility of public affairs. The financial, industrial, and commercial organizations have reached a gigantic size. They are influenced not only by the conditions of the country where they are established, but also by the state of the neighboring countries and of the entire world. In all nations, economic and social conditions undergo extremely rapid changes. Nearly everywhere the existing form of government is again under discussion. The great democracies find themselves face to face with formidable problems concerning their very existence and demanding an immediate solution. And we realize that, despite the immense hopes which humanity has placed in modern civilization, such a civilization has failed in developing men of sufficient intelligence and audacity to guide it along the dangerous road on which it is stumbling. Human beings have not grmv11 so rapidly as the institutions sprung from their brains. It is chiefly the intellectual and moral deficiencies of the political leaders, and their ignorance, which endanger modern nations. 189 THM It appears that the environment, which science and technology have succeeded in developing for man, EC 45I46 Islam and the world not suit him because it has been constructed at random, without regard for his true self. 19 The environment born of our intelligence and our inventions is adjusted neither to our stature nor to our shape. We are unhappy. We degenerate morally and mentally. The groups and nations in which industrial civilization has attained its highest development are precisely those which are becoming weaker and whose return to barbarism is the most rapid. But they do not realize it. They are without protection against the hostile surroundings that science has built around them. In truth, our civilization, like those preceding it, has created certain conditions of existence which, for reasons still obscure, render light itself impossible. The anxiety and the woes of the inhabitants of the modern city arise from their political, economic, and social institutions but, above all, from their own weakness. We are the victims of the backwardness of the sciences of life over those of matter. 191 No advantage is to be gained by increasing the number of mechanical inventions. It would perhaps be as WDL not to accord so much importance to discoveries of physics, astronomy, and chemistry. What is the good of increasing the comfort, the luxury, the beauty, the size, and the complications of our civilization, if our weakness prevents us from guiding it to our best advantage? It is really not worthwhile to go on elaborating a way of living that is bringing about the demoralization and the disappearance of the noblest elements of the great races. It would be far better to pay more attention to ourselves than to construct faster steamers, more comfortable automobiles, cheaper radios, or telescope for examining the rise of the west structure of remote nebulae. There is not the shadow of a doubt that mechanical, physical, and chemical sciences are incapable of giving us intelligence, moral discipline, health, nervous equilibrium, security and peace. 92147 Misuse of scientific inventions. Scientific inventions are in themselves neither good nor bad. They are rendered good or bad by the use to which we put them. Material well-being and power and prestige, having grown to be the most desirable things in life in the West, all the resources of mind and matter are there directed pittox lie towards inventing means and ways which cm1 secure the realization of these objectives with the utmost ease and speed. Gradually, the means have become an end in themselves. Europeans have developed a childish fancy for machines. MD have in 1,000 ways delegated to them the very functions of living. Only half a century ago, comfort was regarded by the Europeans as the sine qua dot, a non of progress. Then, due to various reasons, the emphasis was shifted to speed and now everyone is compulsively seeking it. To quote Jodh again, Disraeli remarked of his contemporaries that they talked of progress because by the aid of a few scientific discoveries, they have succeeded in establishing a society which mistakes comfort for civilization. To adapt Disraeli's remark to ourselves, we might merely substitute speed for comfort. Indeed, it might in truth be said that the ability to change the position of his body on the surface of the earth with ever-increasing speed is probably the most concrete conception of utopia that the mind of the contemporary young person is capable of entertaining. Speed, indeed, is his peculiar god, and upon its altar, quiet, comfort, security and consideration for other persons are ruthlessly jettisoned. 93I48 Islam and Thai world have the contemporary achievements of science brought man nearer to fulfillment of the purposes and ends of his life. Dox modum man, with all his POV1 rare over nature, find himself in a happier position than those who lived, let us say, a couple of centuries ago. For the answers to these questions, we turn once again to Jodh, who says we are enabled to travel very fast from place to place, hut places to which we travel are dim.I.nishingly worth traveling to. Distances are destroyed and nations brought to one another's doorsteps, with the result that international relations were rarely worse, and the strains and stresses engendered by these new facilities for knowing our neighbors bid fair to engulf our world in war. The invention of broadcasting has enabled us to speak to the neighboring nations, with the result that each nation exhausts the resources of the air in irritating its neighbors, by attempting to convince them of the superiority of its form of government to theirs. 94 Look at that aeroplane humming across the summer sky, the knowledge of mathematics, of dynamics, and mechanics, the familiarity with electricity and internal combustion, the ingenuity in application of knowledge, the skill in the working of woods and metals that have gone into its making, are such as to suggest that its inventors were supermen. The intrepidity, resolution, and courage which were shown by the early flying men were the qualities of heroes. Now consider the purposes for which the modern aeroplane has been and seems increasingly again to be used to drop bombs to shatter and choke, bomb and poison and dismember defenseless people. These, one feels, are the purposes of idiots or devils. The rise Thuist 149 Let us consider how our treatment of the metal, gold, will strike the future historian. Tai will describe how we had learned to signal for gold by wireless telegraphy. He will reproduce photographs showing the ingenious contrivances by which bankers weighed and counted it. He will dwell on the daily miracle by which we defied gravitation as we transported it from capital to capital, and he will then have to record how these semi-savages, skillful and daring as they were in their mechanical triumphs, were so incapable of slight efforts at international cooperation which the control of gold demanded that, having acquired the metal, their sole concern was to bury it again as quickly as possible. Thus, the operations of international finance would appear to him as a process whereby, with infinite cost and labor, men extracted metal from the bowels of the earth in South Africa in order that they might rebury it in the vaults of London, New York, and Paris. R95 The destructive nature of scientific inventions. Western people are so preoccupied with the pleasures of the senses that they have all regard for mental and spiritual needs. Irresponsible literature and erroneous philosophical concepts have perverted their minds as the most wholesome food turns into poison in an unhealthy stomach. Their clever scientific achievements have become in their hands a curse, not only for themselves but for the whole world. Lt was remarked by Sir Anthony Eden in the course of a speech during the last World War that unless something can be done, the people of this world, in the latter part of this century, are going to 2VC as troglodytes, cave people, and go back to the days of cave DWDHNG. It is fantastic that all countries are now spending millions on protecting themselves against AI-0 Islam and the world weapon of which they are all afraid, but on the control of which they cannot agree. I sometimes wonder how the world today would strike a visitor from another planet, who would find us preparing the means for our own destruction and even exchanging information on how we are to do it. 196 When Eden spoke these words, he could scarcely have imagined that science, freed from the control of religion, would, within the course of that very war, perfect the technique of genocide to e.g. RCE that would stagger even its most fanatical enthusiasts. After years of intense toil and after spending immense amounts of money, the United States, at last, succeeded in manufacturing the dreadful atomic bomb. Its destructive power and range of effect were first tested at 5.38 m. On July 16, 1945, on a lifeless steel tower and an unfeeling atmosphere. Then the second experiment was made on the living enemy on August 6, 1945, the Japa 11SA town of Hiroshima was blasted out of existence. With the thunderous intensity of the explosion and the heat and the heavy pressure of the atmosphere, the whole town was instantaneously reduced to a heap of debris. Within a few minutes the explosion sent a mountain of smoke rising high into the air, beneath which raged a terrific fire. 197 of the deadly AFIER effects of the atomic bomb, Stuart Gilder writes. It is now clear that, although they did not know beforehand what the detailed results would be, the atomic scientists did know that they were deliberately using a weapon the second AI effects of which might leave mankind itself without defense against extermination. These are being described by reporters in Hiroshima as atomic plague. Victims apparently untouched by blast or heat have died and are continuing to die through disintegration of their blood. First their white and then the Rhizif Thuist 151 their red corpuscles disappear, their hair falls out and they perish by rotting to pieces as they live. This appears to be due to radioactive substances which are released into the atmosphere when the explosion occurs and are absorbed through the skin or breathed into the lungs. Gilder goes on to say this news is shocking and horrifying for the whole world, which did not know that such a bomb existed and is still ignorant of the properties of radioactive metals. It was well known to the scientil.ts more than 30 years ago that the most fearful tyranny of this bomb was that there would be no remedy for its FGARFI.il effects and that it would be destructive for the whole of humanity. It has been reported that in an attempt to protect themselves, the Japanese survivors have been wearing homemade masks. Apparently these masks are the same as are worn by the Japanese to protect themselves from the CFTCCTS of severe cold. They are, of course, as useless as the vet pieces of doth which some of the Abyssinian soldiers had wrapped round their noses to ward off the effects of poisonous gases sprayed by Mussolini's bombers. Another report says air crews of super fortresses which made the atomic assaults on Japan reported that after the fall of the bomb dust and smoke rose 9 miles into the air. It was propelled by a most tremendous force. Prof. Plesk suggests that there should be careful scientific checks on the condition of the people living as far as 2 miles from the point of the explosion to discover whether they be VE-152 Islam and the world absorbed, through inhalation or other means, any of the radioactive gases given off from particles of dust. It would not be surprising if the world may waken one grim morning to hear the news that people living thousands of miles away from Japan are developing symptoms of atomic plague. If the effects of the atom bombing of Japan are to deter the world from war, then the world must know all the facts of its effects as quickly and in as much detail as possible. If a small atom bomb propels poisonous dust 9 miles into the air, then it is reasonable to suppose that a bigger one will propel it higher and scatter it over a far wider area. R98